Imagine this. A wealthy businessman, a man who has built an empire from nothing, sits at an exclusive restaurant, completely unaware that the person sitting across from him, his own wife, is about to end his life. She smiles. She plays the role of the devoted spouse, but beneath the surface, her plan is already in motion. And then, a boy, a nobody, a street kid who wasn't even supposed to be there, shouts, "Don't drink that!" The entire restaurant freezes. All eyes turn to him. Who is he? Why is he interrupting? But what happens next changes everything. What if the person who saves you isn't the one you expected? What if a single moment could reveal all the lies you've been blind to? And what if, out of nowhere, two lives, one built on power, one built on survival, collide in the most unexpected way? This is a story about betrayal, survival, and an unlikely bond that changes both lives forever. Trust is dangerous, but ignorance, that can kill you. Stay till the end. You won't believe how this unfolds. If you love gripping stories that make you think, hit that like button. Subscribe for more incredible tales of truth, survival, and unexpected heroes. Comment below. What would you do in this situation? Would you speak up or would you walk away? Now, let's begin. The Marina Blue was more than just a restaurant. It was a stage, a place where the city's most powerful figures gathered, their every move choreographed like a silent performance. Deals were made over vintage wines, fortunes were decided between delicate bites of caviar, and reputations were built or destroyed without a single raised voice. It was the kind of place where appearances were everything. And tonight, at a prime corner table with a breathtaking view of the ocean, Elliot Green sat at the center of it all. At 62, he was a man who had spent decades turning empires into dust and building his own from the ruins. A self-made billionaire known for his ruthless intellect, his calculated risks, and his unshakable control over everything in his world. But tonight, his world felt off. He sat with his back straight, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, his silver cufflinks glinting under the warm chandeliers. His dark hair, speckled with strands of gray, was neatly combed back, and his sharp blue eyes flicked across the restaurant, as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. A faint tightness had settled in his chest. Not fear, not pain. Just a subtle discomfort, like the feeling of standing in a house built on an unseen fault line. His fingers tapped lightly against the polished wooden table. He had felt this way for weeks now, restless, distracted, and he wasn't sure why. Across from him, Lana Green, his wife of 2 years, flashed him a soft, indulgent smile. She was beautiful in the way that didn't seem real. Long, raven black hair cascaded over her shoulders, her emerald dress hugging her frame in an effortless display of elegance. A thin diamond bracelet slid down her wrist as she reached for her wine glass, her red lips curving ever so slightly. But Elliot saw it, the same way he always had, a smile that was flawless but empty. "Darling," she murmured, tilting her head slightly. "You seem distracted." Elliot blinked, forcing himself to focus. "No," he said lightly, "just thinking." Lana's eyes gleamed with amusement as she reached across the table, lightly running her fingers over the back of his hand. "You think too much." Elliot exhaled through his nose, offering a small smirk. "That's how I built an empire." She laughed, but it was a sound without weight, polished, perfect, practiced. And for the first time in a long time, Elliot wondered if he had ever really known her at all. Outside the grand glass windows, a different world existed, one that none of the Marina Blues guests ever noticed. A boy stood just beyond the restaurant's warm glow, lingering in the shadows of the alleyway, watching. His name was Theo. At 13, he had already learned more about survival than most adults ever would. His jacket was too big, the sleeves frayed, hanging loosely over his small frame. His sneakers, once white, were now faded and torn at the edges. He was hungry, but more than that, he was watching. Because even from out here, beyond the restaurant's glittering walls, he could sense it. Something wasn't right. Theo had spent years reading people. Not the way rich people did, analyzing stock markets and boardroom competitors. No, Theo read people the way a stray animal reads the streets, instinctively, ruthlessly, because his survival depended on it. And right now his instincts were screaming. His dark eyes locked onto the couple inside, the old man and his wife. She was beautiful, dressed like wealth itself. But her movements, the way she tilted her wrists so carefully, the way her fingers disappeared into her handbag just a little too smoothly, they were too controlled. Then in one fluid motion, her fingers curled around a tiny glass vial. Theo's breath hitched. His heart slammed against his ribs. And suddenly he was 9 years old again. Theo had seen this before. Not in a place like Marina Blue, but in a cramped, rotting apartment on the south side of the city. His mother had been standing by the stove, stirring a pot of thin soup. She had been smiling, not because life was good, but because that was the kind of person she was. And then, without warning, she had dropped. Theo remembered the panic, the way her eyes had gone wide, her fingers twitching as she gasped for breath. He had screamed for help. No one had come. When they finally did, it was too late. The coroner had called it an unfortunate accident, but Theo knew better. He had seen the man who had come the night before. He had seen the vial, just like the one in Lana Green's hands now, and no one had listened to him. Just a poor kid from the wrong side of the city. And now he was watching it happen again. His stomach twisted. He could leave, just turn around, disappear back into the shadows, pretend he had never seen anything. People like him didn't belong in places like this. People like him didn't get involved in the problems of people like them, because people like him didn't get listened to. But then his eyes flicked back to the old man. Elliot Green had no idea what was about to happen to him. Theo's hands clenched, and in that moment, he made a decision. Before he could second-guess himself, before he could talk himself out of it, he moved straight for the restaurant doors. The moment Theo stepped inside, the shift in atmosphere was instant. The warmth of the restaurant pressed against his cold skin, the scent of wine and roasted meats flooding his senses. The quiet, expensive hum of conversation barely faltered. Until they noticed him, until they saw the street kid standing in their world. A waiter started toward him immediately. "I'm sorry, sir, but—" Theo didn't let him finish. His eyes locked onto the old man. Elliot's hand was already lifting the wine glass to his lips. Too close. Too close. Theo's chest tightened. And then he did the only thing he could. He shouted, "Don't drink that!" For a split second, no one moved. The warm hum of conversation, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china, the quiet elegance that defined Marina Blue. All of it stopped. Every head in the restaurant turned toward the source of the outburst. A boy, thin, ragged, out of place. A street kid standing in the doorway, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, his dark eyes wide with urgency. And at the center of it all, seated at a table with a glass of red wine hovering inches from his lips, was Elliot Green. His hand froze mid-motion. His sharp blue eyes flicked up to meet the boy's gaze, confused, startled, searching. Across from him, Lana went rigid. For the briefest of moments, her emerald eyes flickered with something unreadable. Shock, panic, fear. But then in a heartbeat, she recovered. Her carefully curated composure snapped back into place like the click of a lock, and she turned her head slowly, her expression slipping into one of controlled irritation. "What on earth?" she began, her voice smooth as silk. Theo cut her off. "You can't drink that," he gasped, his voice raw, urgent. "She put something in it. I saw her." The words slammed into the restaurant like a gunshot. A ripple of gasps spread across the room. And just like that, the world tilted. Lana's eyes narrowed. For a brief, dangerous moment, she simply stared at the boy. Then just as quickly, she laughed. The sound was light, effortless, practiced. "Oh my God," she exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "Bernard, are you seriously listening to this?" She turned to the surrounding guests, offering them a look of apologetic amusement, as if they were all in on some absurd joke. "Somebody please get this boy out of here," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of exasperation and indulgence. But Theo wasn't backing down. "I saw you," he snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. You had a vial in your bag. You poured something in his wine when he wasn't looking. Another ripple of whispers spread through the restaurant. A waiter hesitated mid-step. A couple at the next table glanced at each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to something closer to concern. Lana's fingers tightened subtly around the stem of her wine glass. She could feel it, the atmosphere beginning to turn. She had to shut this down, fast. She sighed, shaking her head, and then she played her final card. Lana turned back to Elliot, placing a gentle, manicured hand over his. "Darling," she murmured, voice softer now, full of gentle patience. "He's just trying to get attention. You know how these kids are." Theo felt his stomach turn. There it was, the tactic he had seen 1,000 times. She was making him the problem. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She was in control. "I'm sure he just wants money," Lana continued, offering the boy a delicate, pitying smile. "Or food. I'm happy to give him something if that's what this is about." And just like that, the shift began. The whispers changed. Doubt began to slip into the room. Because who were they going to believe? A woman in an emerald dress, poised and elegant, a fixture of high society? Or a boy in a frayed hoodie, standing with his fists clenched like a stray dog backed into a corner? Theo saw it happening. He felt the ground tilting beneath him. He knew how this worked. The system was rigged. No one would listen. No one ever did. And then, Elliot spoke. He exhaled slowly, setting the wineglass back down on the table. For the first time, his full attention was on the boy. His sharp blue eyes narrowed slightly, studying him, measuring. Theo stood his ground. "You saw something?" Elliot asked, his voice calm but not dismissive. Theo nodded fiercely. "Yes. She took something from her purse. Small, like a vial. It was clear. She poured it in when you weren't looking." Lana let out a breathy laugh. "This is absurd," she muttered, rubbing her temples. But Elliot didn't look at her. He was still watching Theo. And for the first time, Theo saw something in his eyes. Something other than doubt. Recognition. Elliot was a man who had spent his life reading people. And right now, staring at the thin, street-worn boy in front of him, he saw something real. Something Lana didn't expect. Hesitation. And Lana saw it too. And suddenly, she wasn't smiling anymore. Lana's pulse kicked up. This was spiraling too fast. She could feel it slipping out of her control, shifting against her. She had to end it. "Now, Bernard," she said, voice tight but controlled, "drink your wine and let's go." Elliot didn't move, didn't reach for the glass, didn't even acknowledge her words. Instead, he asked Theo, "If I test this wine, will I find something?" Theo's jaw clenched. His voice was quieter this time, but steady. "Yes." Elliot sat back, slowly, deliberately, and then he spoke the words that shattered everything. "Waiter." A uniformed server who had been watching the scene unfold in the stunned silence stepped forward hesitantly. Sir?" Elliot gestured to the wineglass. "Have someone test this?" Lana's breath hitched, and for the first time, the mask cracked. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Her fingers tightened around the tablecloth. She had to fix this. She had to fix this now. Her lips parted, ready to lie, ready to twist the situation back in her favor. But then, she made a fatal mistake. She saw the way Elliot was looking at her, and for the first time she realized, he already knew. He wasn't waiting for an explanation. He wasn't waiting for her to talk her way out of it. He was waiting for confirmation. And in that moment, she panicked. Lana's world had been built on control. For years, she had orchestrated every moment, curated every smile, wielded her charm like a weapon. But now, the script had slipped from her hands. The moment Elliot said, "Have someone test this," something inside her snapped. The restaurant had never been this quiet before. A waiter hesitated, looking between Elliot and the untouched glass of wine, before nodding quickly and stepping away. The murmurs around them grew louder, thick with disbelief, with curiosity, with something dangerously close to certainty. Theo stood frozen. He had done everything he could, and yet the real moment of truth was still ahead. He braced himself, because he knew what came next. Desperation. Lana's fingers twitched against the tablecloth. She could feel the walls closing in. The waiter would come back. The wine would be tested. And when that happened, it would be over. Her mind spun, calculating. She had two choices. One, stay. Try to talk her way out of this. Manipulate. Twist the narrative. But she had lost control. Elliot's eyes told her that much. Second run. And in a split second, she chose. She moved. Violently. Her chair slammed backward as she stood so abruptly that her wine glass nearly toppled over. The nearest waiter flinched. Gasps rang through the restaurant as Lana turned on her heel and bolted. Her emerald dress whipped behind her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor as she raced for the exit. A blur of movement, she shoved past a stunned couple, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Theo's heart slammed into his ribs. She was going to get away. Not this time. He lunged before anyone else did. Not the security, not the waiters, not even Elliot. Theo was faster. He sprinted, weaving through tables, ignoring the startled cries of wealthy diners who had never seen violence up close. Lana was seconds from the door when he reached her, and then he threw himself forward. The impact was brutal. Theo hit her hard, his small frame colliding with her side, sending both of them crashing to the floor. Lana screamed. She kicked, clawed, twisted, but Theo held on. His breath was ragged, his hands trembling, but he dug his nails into the fabric of her sleeve and didn't let go. She wasn't escaping. Not tonight. The restaurant erupted. Waiters scrambled backward. A man near the bar gasped audibly, his hand over his mouth. Elliot rose from his chair, his movements slow, measured, as if he had already known this would happen. The doors to the restaurant burst open. Two uniformed officers strode in. "Freeze!" one of them barked. Lana went still. For a second, just a second, she looked like an animal trapped in headlights. And then suddenly she started talking. Fast. Panicked. "This is a misunderstanding," she gasped, struggling to regain her composure. "He attacked me. This child came out of nowhere and started screaming. You saw it. You all saw it." But no one moved. No one nodded. No one spoke in her defense. Because the truth was right there, spilled across the marble floor. Among the shattered remains of her handbag, among the lipstick tubes and credit cards and crumpled receipts, the tiny glass vial lay in plain sight. The evidence, the proof. The restaurant fell silent. One of the officers bent down, picked up the vial, and turned it over in his fingers. His gaze lifted, cold and unreadable. He looked at Elliot. "Sir?" Elliot's face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Arrest her!" Lana snapped. "No!" she screamed as the officers grabbed her arms, yanking them behind her back. "No, you don't understand. You can't do this." The handcuffs clicked, and with that single sound, her world shattered. She thrashed violently, her breath coming in desperate gasps. She looked at Elliot then, wild-eyed, furious, pleading. "You can't believe this," she spat. "You know me. You know I wouldn't." Elliot stared at her, and for the first time Lana realized he wasn't angry. He wasn't even disgusted. He just looked tired. "You were right about one thing," he said quietly. Lana's breath hitched. Elliot exhaled. "You were never meant to be in my life this long," Lana screamed. It was a sound of pure rage, pure desperation, but it didn't matter anymore. The officers dragged her toward the exit. The doors swung open, and then she was gone. For a long time, no one spoke. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on the restaurant like a storm that had just passed but left destruction in its wake. Elliot exhaled, slow and controlled, rubbing his temple. It was over. The woman who had once shared his home, his life, his trust, was gone, and yet he felt nothing. No grief, no loss, just emptiness. His gaze flicked downward. Theo was still on the floor, his breath shaky, his hoodie slightly disheveled from the struggle. The boy hadn't moved. For the first time, Elliot truly looked at him. Not as a distraction, not as a problem, but as something more. Slowly, Elliot extended a hand. Theo hesitated. Then he took it, and in that single motion, everything changed. The Marina Blue had returned to its polished routine. The music had resumed. The waiters moved through the restaurant with their usual grace, and the quiet murmur of conversation once again filled the space. But beneath the surface, nothing was the same, because for the first time in his life, Elliot Green had lost control. He sat at his table, the same table where he had almost died, staring at the untouched glass of poison wine. Everything around him moved forward, but he stayed still. It was over. Lana was gone. The woman he had once trusted, once shared a life with, was now in the back of a police car, her carefully crafted world crumbling into dust. And yet he felt nothing. Not rage, not sorrow. Just emptiness. Like standing in the ruins of a house he hadn't realized was already falling apart. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Then for the first time in a long while, he asked himself, "What the hell have I been doing all these years?" Elliot had spent decades building walls, walls that kept competitors at bay, walls that turned business into war, walls that protected him from the world. And yet, he had let her in. He had let Lana Green slip past every defense. Had he been blind, stupid, weak? "You weren't supposed to live this long." The words clawed at him. Had she always been waiting? From the very beginning, had it all been a lie? Or worse, had she once loved him, but somewhere along the way, decided she'd rather have his money than his presence? That thought was somehow more painful. He leaned forward, pressing his fingertips against his forehead. For years, he had believed that money, power, control, those were the things that mattered. And yet tonight, none of them had saved him. The only reason he was still breathing was because of a boy who had nothing. His eyes flicked across the table. Theo was still there, still standing, still watching him. Theo felt the shift, the way the restaurant had moved on without him, the way eyes flicked toward him, then away, dismissing him now that the spectacle was over. He knew this feeling. He had never belonged here. He had done what he came to do, saved the old man, stopped a murder. Now he should leave. That was how this worked. You step in, you step out. No one remembers you. But then, why weren't his feet moving? Why was he still standing here, waiting for something he couldn't name? His fists clenched inside his sleeves. He had spent his life staying ahead of disappointment. Because the second you start to believe in something, that's when you get hurt. And he had been hurt enough. So why did part of him still hope? His stomach twisted. He turned slightly, ready to go. And then, "Kid!" The voice stopped him. Theo hesitated. Slowly he turned back. Elliot was still seated, still watching him with those sharp, calculating blue eyes. But for the first time, they weren't just calculating. There was something else, something unspoken. "Sit," Elliot said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Theo frowned. He knew what this was. A favor. A thank you. "Here's some money. Now get lost." And he didn't want it. "I don't need anything," Theo muttered, shaking his head. Elliot smirked slightly, but there was no humor in it. "I didn't ask if you needed anything," he said. "I asked you to sit." Theo hesitated. This was a mistake. He should leave. He should... But his feet weren't listening. His body moved before his mind could stop it. Slowly, cautiously, he sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Theo's hands curled into fists in his lap, his shoulders tense. Elliot studied him, not like a problem to be solved, but like a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. "You saved my life tonight," Elliot finally said. Theo shrugged. "I couldn't just let it happen." Elliot exhaled through his nose. "Most people would have." Theo didn't answer, because he knew it too well. Silence stretched between them. Then, Elliot leaned back slightly. "I spent 62 years building my life," he said, "and tonight, none of it meant a damn thing." Theo frowned. "What do you mean?" Elliot gestured vaguely. "Money, power, influence, the kind of things people kill for." His lips pressed into a thin line. "The kind of things people poison for." Theo stayed quiet. He understood the feeling, realizing that nothing you built could save you. Elliot turned his gaze toward Theo. "But you did." Theo's stomach twisted. He didn't know how to respond to that. So instead, he asked the question that had been nagging at him since the moment Elliot stopped him from leaving. Why am I still here? Elliot studied him for a moment, then said, because I don't let people who saved my life walk away. Theo inhaled sharply. There it was, the thing he had been afraid of. Theo shifted in his seat. I don't want a handout, he muttered. I don't want your money. Elliot nodded, as if he expected that. I wouldn't insult you like that, he said simply. Theo frowned. Then what do you want? Elliot was silent for a moment. Then he exhaled. I don't believe in coincidences, he said finally. I don't think you were meant to walk past this place tonight by accident. Theo hesitated, because deep down he didn't believe in coincidences either. Elliot leaned forward slightly. You don't have to decide now, he said, but if you're willing to take a risk, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. I think we could both use a change. Theo swallowed. He didn't know what that meant, but for some reason, he wanted to find out. Outside, the city was the same as it had always been, but for Theo, something had shifted. Elliot rose from his chair. Theo followed. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit him, sharp and real. For the first time in a long time, Theo wasn't walking away alone, and neither was Elliot. The past had been shattered. The future was unknown. But for the first time, they weren't afraid of what came next. The night air outside Marina Blue was sharp and crisp, cutting through the warmth of the restaurant like a blade. The city stretched beyond them, loud, restless, indifferent. Elliot Green stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket, his face unreadable. Behind him, Theo lingered near the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his oversized hoodie, his heartbeat still unsteady from the events of the night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elliot had given him a choice, and now Theo had to decide. His fingers curled tighter inside his sleeves. Everything in him screamed to walk away. That was how he had survived for years, never staying in one place too long, never trusting anyone enough to get comfortable. People always changed their minds. People always left. People always let you down. But as he stood there, staring at the street stretching ahead, for the first time, walking away didn't feel like the right choice. Because for the first time, someone had actually given him one. Elliot stood at the curb, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, watching the boy in his periphery. He could feel Theo's hesitation, the way the kid was calculating every possible outcome. Elliot had spent his whole life reading people, and right now he saw a boy who had spent years being disappointed, who had spent too long waiting for the other shoe to drop. So he did something he rarely did. He let the silence stretch. He didn't try to convince him, didn't offer reassurances or promises, because he knew something about people like Theo. They didn't trust words. They only trusted actions. So instead, Elliot reached into his pocket, pulled out his car keys, and without looking at the boy, said, "If you're coming, get in." Then he turned, stepped into the sleek black sedan parked at the curb, and pulled the door shut behind him. No pleading, no coaxing, just a door that was open if Theo wanted it. A door that, for the first time in his life, Theo had the power to walk through. Theo stared at the car. His breath felt too tight in his chest. Everything in him was at war. Run. Stay. Run. Stay. His past screamed at him. This was a trap, a temporary kindness that would disappear the moment it became inconvenient. But then something shoved against that voice. A smaller voice. A voice that sounded like hope. Because deep down, he had wanted someone to choose him for so long. And now, someone had. The weight of it hit him hard. His fists clenched. And before he could talk himself out of it, he moved. His feet carried him forward, past the doubts, past the fear. And he opened the car door. He slipped inside. The door clicked shut. And in that single movement, everything changed. The inside of the car was quiet. The city noise faded into the background, muffled by the thick glass. The scent of expensive leather and something faintly spiced, Elliot's cologne, filled the space. For a moment, Theo just sat there, staring at the dashboard, trying to process the fact that he was actually here, that he hadn't run, that for the first time, he had chosen to stay. Elliot shifted slightly in his seat, but didn't turn the engine on yet. Instead, he glanced at Theo. "You sure?" Theo swallowed. His hands curled into fists, but his voice, though quiet, was steady. "I'm here, aren't I?" Elliot gave a small approving nod, and with that, he started the car. The hum of the engine was low and smooth, a stark contrast to the reckless noise of the streets Theo was used to. As they pulled away from the curb, Theo stared out the window, watching as the city blurred past. A city that, for the first time, wasn't pushing him away. They drove in silence for a while. It wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. Theo hadn't realized how much he had grown used to noise. Constant shouting, honking, the sounds of the streets that never let him rest. But here, in the quiet, he felt something strange, something close to peace. After a few minutes, Elliot finally spoke. "Just one rule." Theo glanced at him. "Yeah?" Elliot kept his eyes on the road. "You're not sleeping on the streets again." Theo's chest tightened. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he could believe it, because people had promised things before, and those promises had always been broken. But Elliot wasn't promising anything. He was just stating a fact, and somehow, that made it feel more real. Theo nodded once, staring down at his hands. And that was that. Elliot had spent decades building an empire. He had wealth, power, influence, everything a man could want. And yet tonight, he had almost lost everything. Not just his life, but his belief in people. And then, a kid who had nothing had saved him. Not for money, not for favors, just because it was the right thing to do. And Elliot wasn't about to let that go to waste. As the city lights blurred outside, he glanced at Theo once more. "You ever had a real job?" Theo scoffed. "No." Elliot smirked. "You're about to." Theo raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" Elliot shrugged. "Whatever I damn well decide." For the first time that night, Theo smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about tomorrow with fear. He was thinking about it with possibility. And that was something. The car rolled smoothly through the city streets. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Somewhere, a kid curled up in an alleyway, waiting for morning. But not Theo. Not tonight. Tonight, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had somewhere to go. The road stretched ahead, unknown, unpredictable. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. And as the car disappeared into the night, a lesson remained in the air. A lesson for anyone who had watched. That sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who save you. That sometimes family isn't something you're born into. It's something you choose. And sometimes a single moment, a single choice, is enough to change everything. Forever. This story is more than just a tale of betrayal and survival. It carries powerful lessons about human nature, trust, and the unexpected ways lives can change. The first lesson is that the truth always has a way of coming out. Lana built her life on deception, carefully orchestrating her every move. But in the end, a single moment shattered everything. No matter how well-crafted a lie may be, the truth will always find a way to surface. Another powerful takeaway is that help can come from the most unexpected places. Elliot Green, a man with power, wealth, and influence, had everything at his disposal. Yet the person who saved his life was a boy with nothing. This reminds us that sometimes the people society overlooks are the ones who hold the most value. Never underestimate someone based on their circumstances. Courage is another key theme. Theo had every reason to stay silent. He was just a kid, ignored by the world, with no proof except what he saw. But he still spoke up because he knew it was the right thing to do. Real bravery is standing up for what's right, even when no one believes you, even when you are alone. The story also reveals that trust should never be given blindly. Elliot was a man who had built an empire on calculated decisions, yet he failed to see the danger within his own home. Trust should be earned, not assumed, and sometimes the people we hold closest can be the ones who betray us, while those we least expect can be the ones who truly stand by us. Beyond that, the story highlights the power of a single act of kindness. Theo didn't step forward for money or reward. He did it because he couldn't stand by and watch someone be harmed. Yet in doing so, He not only changed Elliot's fate, but his own. A single moment of doing the right thing can lead to opportunities, relationships, and a future that no one saw coming. And perhaps the most profound lesson of all is that family isn't always about blood. It's about choice. In the end, Elliot and Theo weren't bound by genetics, but by something stronger: mutual respect, trust, and the experience that had forever changed both of their lives. It reminds us that family is about the people who choose to stand by us when it matters most. Life is unpredictable. Sometimes the ones you expect to protect you are the ones who betray you, and the people you least expect to help you are the ones who save you. In the end, what matters isn't how much money or power you have. It's the choices you make, the people you trust, and the courage you show when faced with the truth.